Today we'll be unboxing Samsung's latest M series smartphone, the Galaxy M31. Some of the key highlights of the smartphone are its 64 megapixel quad rear camera setup, a 6000 mAh battery and a full HD plus Super AMOLED display. So let's not waste any more time and quickly unbox this smartphone. This is the box of the Samsung Galaxy M31. The packaging is pretty minimal with only an image of the phone on the front and the name mentioned on the side. Apart from this, there's nothing noteworthy about the box. So let's go ahead and unbox the Galaxy M31. The first thing we see is the phone itself. Let's take it out of the plastic wrapping and boot it up. As you can see, we have the space black color variant with us. For now, let's put the device aside and check out what else we get in the box. So there's a sleeve which is almost hidden right here. In this you get the usual documents along with a SIM eject tool. Moving on, there's a fast charging brick. And finally, a USB Type-C cable. Here's a quick look at everything that you get in the box of the Samsung Galaxy M31. The Samsung Galaxy M31 features a 6.4-inch Full HD Plus Infinity U Super AMOLED display with Corning Gorilla Glass 3 for protection. This phone is powered by the octa-core Exynos 9611 SoC coupled with 6GB of RAM. The storage options are 64GB and 128GB, and you can expand this by up to 512GB using a micro SD card. The volume and power buttons are on the right, while the dual nano SIM slots along with a dedicated micro SD card slot are on the left. The bottom has a 3.5mm headphone jack, a USB Type-C port, the primary microphone and a single speaker. Finally, there's a secondary microphone at the top. The Galaxy M31 sports a 6000 mAh battery under the hood and supports 15-watt fast charging. On the software front, the phone runs One UI 2 based on Android 10. As for authentication, there's a capacitive fingerprint sensor at the back. In terms of imaging capabilities, the Galaxy M31 sports a quad rear camera setup which features a 64 megapixel primary camera. This is coupled with an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle camera, a 5 megapixel depth camera and a 5 megapixel macro camera. For selfies, you get a 32 megapixel camera at the front which supports 4K video recording. That was our unboxing and first look at the Samsung Galaxy M31. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video and make sure to share it with others. Thanks for watching.
So before we begin the analysis of the images themselves, let's quickly just go over the specs of the camera on the Galaxy M31. You've got a 64 megapixel primary camera with an aperture of f1.8. You've got a secondary 5 megapixel macro camera. You've got an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera and an additional depth sensor. So that's 4 cameras on the back. On the front, you have a 32 megapixel primary camera which is also able to shoot in ultra wide mode and also offer you a cropped perspective in case you need it. The 32 megapixel sensor, by the way, is capable of binning the image if need be, so we've got that as well. Now, shooting with the M31, there are a few things that stand out right from the very beginning. One, the focusing system on the M31's primary rear camera is actually very impressive, as it's able to lock focus not just on subjects that are far away but also those that are close. So if you like shooting detailed shots of, let's say, your food or people or small objects, this camera should be able to focus. You may think that you could switch to the macro mode and do the same thing there, but what we noticed was when you're shooting in the macro mode, let's say if you want to shoot something like this in the macro mode, you will have challenges with getting the distance right because the macro lens has no autofocus. So you have to physically move the smartphone forward and backwards in order to nail the focus. And sometimes what that may result in is you actually accidentally hitting the subject. So it's useful in some scenarios, but not all. But what is good is that the focusing works, not just in good light, but also in relatively poor light. Of course, in pitch darkness, it's not going to work, but in situations like these where I was out walking in a mall the other day at night and it was able to focus just fine. Also, for my test shot, we have this bookcase that we shoot in good lighting conditions and in all near pitch dark conditions, and the M31 was able to lock focus again. So in terms of focus, I'm not very worried. Now, talking about the image quality itself, it's obvious that the binned image from the 64 megapixel sensor is far superior to the native 64 megapixel output. Case in point being these two images which were shot keeping the same subject in focus and not moving the frame at all. In the 64 megapixel image, we see that the subject is well lit, the detail retention is very good, the image is pretty sharp, but where we see some loss is in the background when it comes to the dynamic range. The highlights in the skies are completely clipped and you really cannot see anything beyond the leaves here. But then if you see the 12 megapixel image, the background completely changes and everything is now visible very clearly. This could be due to several factors. It could be because maybe the smartphone's hardware is not fast enough to apply the HDR algorithm to a 64 megapixel image, or it could just be that binning a 64 megapixel image into 12 is resulting in a lot more information that can be represented in the image. So it's one of those two scenarios, but the bottom line really remains that shooting in 12 megapixel will give you far higher dynamic range. Like, I'm not even kidding. Just look at the differences between this and this. It's a lot. So shoot in 12, you're better off, especially if you're going to be working in low light. In terms of the detail retention and sharpness, it's surprisingly good. Now, walking around a camera museum, in fact, in Gurgaon, it was very surprising that even indoors, the M31 was able to take nice, sharp images of objects that were in fact kept not just behind glass, but also had very weird and problematic lighting. So overall, like, shooting with this has been a pretty reliable experience. I did not have any instance where I felt that, oh, I have to take out my other more expensive smartphone to take photos because this was not being able to cut it. That was never the case, which leads me to actually be very surprised and very impressed with what Samsung has done with a phone of this caliber. Now, in low light, yes, you do not have any detail retention. Everything, when you zoom into a picture, looks smudged. But what you do get is that if you're using night mode, the image will appear brighter. So there is more dynamic range being captured by the sensor and being put into the image, but that's pretty much it. In terms of the ultra wide lens, there is again no autofocus there, and you do have noticeable softness of the edges as seen in, let's say, a photo like this one, where if I zoom into the edges, you see everything starts to stretch out, especially over here in this corner and even in the bottom left corner over here. So, but this is thankfully not necessarily a problem with the camera itself, but generally how ultra wide lenses work. Even when you're shooting ultra wide on a DSLR, you tend to notice some softening on the edges, but it is not very pronounced, so that's good. The lack of autofocus, however, does make it very difficult to shoot good images, because if you've got a subject who is sitting close to the camera, for example, in this case, my dog, I was just not able to get the photo right. Like, the perspective was amazing and I wanted him to appear larger than life, but because the camera cannot focus on something that close, it just didn't end up being a usable image. So my dog is actually slightly out of focus. That being said, I mean, it really comes down to you and how you would want to frame your subjects, but the fact that there is an ultra wide camera is pretty impressive. For macro, unfortunately, I preferred using the primary camera to take close-up shots instead of the macro lens, because, for example, with this photo in particular, it was difficult to get the right frame, and also at the same time it was difficult to make sure the shot was crisp because there was a slight breeze which kept the flower moving. So if you ever shot macro, you know that not just you but the subject have to be absolutely still, because when you're so close to the subject, every minutest of the movement will throw the focus off. So it made using the macro lens a little difficult, so I just chose to stay with the primary lens. Also, Quick tip, if you know that you're in balanced lighting conditions, for example, this shot right here, there is no strong light source or anything of that sort, I could have, and you consequently can, switch to the 64 megapixel mode and shoot this image, and then have the ability to sort of go really into the image if you wanted. So that's a quick review of the Samsung Galaxy M31's camera. I hope you've enjoyed this video, hope it's been informational, and in case you have any further questions about what we've talked about, feel free to leave them in the comments below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So thank you guys for watching.